the occupied Palestinian West Bank, there are two different kinds of roads. There's Palestinian roads, there's Israeli roads. The Israeli roads tend to be more modern, constructed by the Israeli government, maintained by the Israeli government for the use of Israeli citizens living in the area who are the settler population, whom I'll talk about. Palestinian roads oftentimes are much less well maintained. Oftentimes they're actually, here the military has actually put in place a roadblock, which means that cars can no longer use it. You have to take your donkey or you have to walk, but you can no longer move on this road by car. Palestinians, for the most part, are not allowed to use the Israeli roads. Maybe you get a permit for a certain, part of a certain road and you have to show your pass. But for the most part, the roads are completely segregated. The settler population is Jewish, while the Palestinian population is predominantly Christian or Muslim. So what this amounts to in practice is one kind of road if you're Jewish and one kind of road if you're Muslim or you're Christian. There's also a complementary system of segregated license plates, with settler cars having yellow plates, Palestinian cars have green or white plates. Here there's a road where they actually have two lanes, one lane for Jewish settlers, one lane for Palestinians, who have to pull over here at the right of what's called a checkpoint, where they'll go through a kind of a screening process, where Palestinians have to show their ID cards. This is like a pass system, basically. So you apply, you get a certain color ID card, and that's what determines whether you have rights or not, which rights you have, etc. It's been compared actually very much to the Apartheid pass system in South Africa, where people's passes were basically their lives, and it determined whether they had rights, which ones they had, etc. So checkpoints can be very disruptive in everyday life to get from one place to the other. Checkpoints are actually located all over the West Bank, not only between the West Bank and Israel, which is what many people think is it's if you're trying to go to, let's say, Tel Aviv or something. Not that would not be problematic, but actually the majority of the checkpoints are inside the West Bank, so they're between Palestinian towns and villages. So even a Palestinian trying to get from their village to the next Palestinian town over to go to university would be stopped at them. And these checkpoints, you mind if I move this a little closer, because I'm finding I can't simultaneously. These checkpoints can be extremely disruptive, right? A mother here, a businesswoman, she doesn't know if she's going to be able to get to work on time. It could take her 15 minutes, it could take her 3 hours, being checked repeatedly over and over again, having to show her pass, perhaps being strip searched, her bags being looked through, being asked a number of questions, waiting perhaps hour after hour. It's very disruptive to daily life. She doesn't know if she'll be able to get to work. She can't be sure she can get back to home to her kids in the evening. Similarly, students, imagine, many of you go to school here, let's say you have class at 9:30 in the morning. Imagine if instead of leaving your dorm at 9:15, you had to leave wherever you live, let's say with your family in a nearby place, you had to leave at 5:30 in the morning because you had to go through a series of checks where you were stopped, you were asked for your ID, you were asked invasive questions, but people of a different religion or ethnicity from you, they got to pass by. This brings to mind that first pillar of a preferred identity. Does an identity give you privileges over another population? Health is a big issue also. Ambulances have to stop at these checkpoints. Oftentimes they're searched thoroughly, sometimes not let through at all. So you have a lot of really tragic stories about women going into labor at checkpoints, losing their babies. I have a friend, Dawood, an English teacher who you can read about it in my book. I won't tell you the whole story, but essentially his son had an asthma attack, and they were trying to get him to an oxygen tank, and he called me the next morning crying that they had been there hour after hour, and his son died in his arms. The soldiers wouldn't let them cross. They said, "I'm sorry, come back in the morning." He said, "We can't come back, our child is suffering." And they said, "I'm sorry, you're Palestinian, you just can't cross." They're trying to get, mind you, from a Palestinian village to a Palestinian city with a Palestinian hospital. So you have a lot of these stories, and it shows just how disruptive the Palestinian life, actual life, daily life, etc., these systems can be. And we talked about that preferred identity. Of course, if Dawood and his family were a different identity, they would have a totally different experience. Remember, the soldier said, "You're Palestinian, so you can't cross." The settler population living in the area have a very different kind of life. So here's a settlement. Settlements are basically towns or cities of Jewish Israelis who have moved into the Palestinian West Bank. This is internationally recognized Palestinian land. And yet the farmers and families who own the land that these cities and towns were built on are not allowed to live in them. They've been pushed off of them, oftentimes very violently. I'll show you a picture. And yeah, they're not allowed to live there even though it's their own land. Oftentimes they're not even allowed to go anywhere near it for security laws. I have quotes for anyone who's listening on the radio. And you know, this is interesting because, you know, I think a lot of times we have a short memory. You know, this is not something completely new or you know, or bizarre or something we can't make sense of. This is something that's happened over and over and over throughout history. The idea that a country, a foreign country, would come into an area, push off the indigenous population, and build towns and cities for its own civilian population. Have we seen this before? Sure. A country going in, pushing out the indigenous people, plopping down its own people. Right? We've seen this, thank you, yes. All over. Here in the United States, indigenous people here continuously pushed off of their lands, all over Africa, all over the world, really. And there's a word for it. It's called colonization. And this process of colonization continues aggressively. A lot of times, like I said, it's done through violence, where you have actually settlers coming down if Palestinians try to approach their olive groves, being threatened, being shot at, being violently harassed or attacked. Settlers, for the most part, are not held accountable for what they do. There's been, I think I heard recently, it even shocked me, and I'm rarely shocked anymore at this stuff. I think there's been one time when a settler attack was tried, and they got for killing a Palestinian like a month in jail or something like that. Don't quote me, actually. Maybe it may have been a soldier, one case of a soldier being tried. But in any case, you see this complete imbalance. So anyway, for the record, I'm not positive on which demographic it was, but you see this imbalance of what settlers and the Israeli occupying forces can get away with versus Palestinians. And you see this imbalance very strikingly. Palestinians are not allowed to have any kind of weapons, while you have settlers walking around with these huge, American-made weapons. Palestinians, some of them, not necessarily many, but some managed to get a hold of weapons. The vast majority of them have nothing to defend themselves with. And that's the balance of power. Again, we get to this question of, is there a preferred identity? There are settlers who are very violent, who come through, they try to expand their settlement through force, but there's also settlers who, in fact, the majority of them, who come not for ideological reasons, where they think this land is ours, all Palestinians should go or be killed, but for money, because the Israeli government offers them money to move there. So here you can actually see a billboard on an Israeli-only road. It's in Hebrew. It says, "Now more than ever." And underneath it has an offer. It explains, if you move to our community, in this case it's Ariel, which is a settlement in the West Bank, you will be rewarded with 100,000 Israeli shekels, which is roughly, I don't know what it is anymore, let's say 20,000 US dollars. In other words, the Israeli government is actually paying its own citizens to move on to more Palestinian land in the West Bank, to become part of the settler population. They're paying them to do so, and if the Israeli government is paying them, who's really paying them? And the answer is us. There's a great website, aidtoisrael.org, and it was down today, so unfortunately I couldn't get the numbers, but you can go there, you can find out how much the state of Texas, taxpayers in the state of Texas, taxpayers in this Travis County, taxpayers in Austin, are paying towards military aid to Israel. In terms of, nationally speaking, it's $3 billion military aid per year, in violation of a number of U.S. laws, including the Arms Export Control Act, which says basically we can't provide weapons to a country that's using them systematically against a civilian population. Anyway, this, sometimes this seems like something very far away. That might be sad, but we got our own problems here. We are involved in this. We're paying for it. This is something that we can no longer say we don't want to get involved in. To not get involved is to perpetuate, to be complicit in, to continue to actively fund these atrocities. We don't have the luxury of not being involved. You're going to be involved. Are you going to be involved in a productive way or a destructive way? And those are our choices if you're a U.S. taxpayer. Thanks to our incredible generosity, there's settlements all over the West Bank, these red dots here. This is from a few years back, so there's actually even more of them, really carving up the entire area. So I've talked about the West Bank. I'm also going to talk about, I'm really not actually going to give it justice, but the Gaza Strip, the other area that was carved out in 1948. And I've never been to Gaza. I can't speak with any authority on Gaza. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to invite a Palestinian from Gaza to speak on the situation there. But I cannot, my conscience does not allow me to not talk about Gaza. So I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of the situation there. The settler population was evacuated from Gaza in 2005, and some say, well, so the occupation ended. Not at all. Occupation is not defined by settler population, it's defined by control, and the Gaza Strip remains in every way under the strict control of Israel. You have, for example, so Israel maintains full control over borders, airspace, the shores, and the land itself when there are land invasions. Last November, there was a bombardment of Gaza, reminiscent of Operation Cast Lead in late 2008, when more than 1,300 Palestinians were brutally killed, the majority of them civilians. So the people of Gaza are sort of enclosed in an area completely controlled by Israel. They're denied adequate drinking water. Many of the Palestinian aquifers in Gaza have been systematically targeted and destroyed by Israel. In fact, this is something that booklet I talked about covers. Denied electricity and building supplies to rebuild their homes after they've been demolished. Denied adequate medical supplies. There's rampant malnutrition, massive unemployment. Gazans are not allowed to export anything. So even if there's some food on the shelf, you can't buy it. You have no employment. You're not able to export anything. Life is, to put it very mildly, is extremely difficult for the people of Gaza, and many would compare it to a kind of open-air prison where people cannot get in and out. Imagine you're a student in Gaza and you get a scholarship to study at the University of Texas at Austin. You're excited, you got a scholarship, the whole thing is paid for. Too bad, you can't get out. Maybe if you get out, you're not sure you can get back in again. This is the kind of open-air prison that people aptly, I think, refer to. This is a picture of white phosphorus being used against the people of Gaza during Operation Cast Lead. And a lot of people don't know, but Gaza is actually surrounded by a wall itself. And this perhaps gets us thinking again about the West Bank, because in the West Bank, a wall is being built, a wall that is being replicated here on campus, which is awesome. I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to go see it after this talk. You all know about it, but the wall that's being built in the West Bank today with our tax dollars, about 25-foot concrete, twice as high as the Berlin Wall. That's a picture of me and a friend of mine standing in front of it just to show you how big it is. And this wall is being built, again, with our tax dollars. Many, say, well, perhaps you've been told if you're at the wall here on campus, well, it's sad to have a wall, but these people are fighting, and maybe if we can just stick a wall between them, they'll stop fighting. Which is an interesting question. Does separation and segregation bring peace? And also, if you want to separate a population, you would presumably put the wall between Palestinians and Israelis, where the actual wall is being built is not that at all, but actually built oftentimes deviating deeply into the West Bank, where this black and white line is here, leaving much Palestinian land and resources on the other side of the wall, these blue areas, which are parts of the West Bank that have now been further taken by Israel. In the north there is where many of the major water sources are, and maybe I have here, so you have, that's where many of the major aquifers are, the blue areas in the north there that have been now confiscated with the wall, in what's called the seam, the blue areas there. You have settlements with swimming pools in them, taking out water from Palestinian aquifers. And then you have Palestinians in the Jordan Valley, for example, who don't have enough drinking water. And that's the disparity of resource distribution that is facilitated and enabled through these settlements and through the wall. This incredibly gross or grotesque inequality of resource distribution. And then you have also down here the Jerusalem area, which has been cut off more and more from the majority of Palestinians. Palestinians, of course, consider Jerusalem a holy city, for Muslims and Christians as well as Jews. And the majority of Palestinians now are unable to reach their holy sites and their places of worship. And if you factor in, if you factor in not only the wall, but also the checkpoints and settlements and all that other stuff that I talked about, the areas off limits to Palestinians are more like these blue areas. Given all of the other infrastructure of the occupation, leaving Palestinians confined in these smaller and smaller spaces. Recall the second pillar of apartheid, that there's segregation of the population, and one is getting more and more control and access, while the other is squeezed into smaller and smaller areas. And this is the facts on the ground that we see today. The facts that prompt, I think, many logical people to ask, where is a Palestinian state within this current situation? And people are asking that question and maybe looking beyond it. Yes. So anyway, if you just look at this and you come from the framework of security that Israel, whatever it does, maybe it's not so nice, but it's for security. Israel has to secure itself, and it will do what it has to secure itself. That's what I thought. I thought, God, this is really awful. I hate thinking about what Israel is doing. But I kept trying to squeeze it into this framework of, well, it must be because that makes Israelis more secure. That's what I said to myself over and over again. But if you want to make your country secure, you would want to define your borders, right? Strong borders are good for national security. Fortify them, make them strong. But Israel, in its whole history of being a country, has never officially defined its own borders. Its borders keep growing more and more over more and more Palestinian land. Does that make Israel safer? If you want to secure your population, why would you pay them tens of thousands of dollars to leave their homes in Tel Aviv, let's say, and move on to more Palestinian land surrounded by the so-called enemy? That doesn't make them safer. If you want to secure if you want to secure your population, why would you build a wall between Palestinians and other Palestinians? Palestinians, some of them are left now in these blue areas. They're more exposed to Israel. What's going on here? And as we look at the way that these institutions are actually implemented on the ground, we begin to sort of deconstruct this security framework. And many of these things do not make sense within the context of security. So if it's not about security, what is it about? And the four maps that you saw on the tables out there, I think, are very instructive in understanding why all of these institutions that don't really make anybody safer. These four maps show the progression of land transfer in historic Palestine for the last 60, 70 years. The green areas are Palestinian land. The white areas in the first map indicate land that had been purchased by the Jewish Zionist movement. So there were indigenous Jews whom I'll talk about, but these were those who were part of the Jewish nationalist Zionist movement who wanted to come and create a Jewish state in the area. And by 1946, they had acquired about 6 to 8% of the land. 8 is being generous, but let's say 8. In 1947, given the massacres of Jewish people in Nazi Europe, the United Nations decided to give 54% of this section of the Middle East, the white areas there, to the Zionist movement to create a Jewish state as they had been lobbying for, leaving Palestinians with about 46% of the land. So imagine that you are a Palestinian, and you are being offered about half of what you kind of already thought was your land. Palestinians didn't think this was very generous of the United Nations. And likewise, the Zionist movement actually had a problem. They wanted a Jewish state. This was a big win for them. They had lobbied for it in the United Nations. 8 to 54% is a really big gain. But they had a big problem. And that's that they wanted to have a Jewish state. That was the whole point. But the majority of the people who were living in the area where they wanted to have a Jewish state weren't Jewish. They were Muslim and Christian. And you can't have a Jewish state with a non-Jewish majority. And so Zionist forces proceeded to expel the vast majority of the non-Jewish population from the area in what became known to Israelis as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as a Nakba, which means the catastrophe, in which the majority of Palestinians were violently removed from their homes and lands. It went from 54% to 78%, creating the borders that I showed you at the beginning. More than 500 Palestinian villages were razed and depopulated. More than 750,000 Palestinians became refugees fleeing to surrounding countries, to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan, to Egypt, and also to the West Bank and Gaza. The majority of people in Gaza are already refugees. Given everything I said, they've already lost everything. This is on top of that. It really, puts an extra sort of reality on top of everything that's going on. The fact that these are majority people who have already been kicked out, everything taken. A lot of those refugees still live in surrounding areas. I'm sure there are refugee Palestinian descendants of Palestinian refugees in the room today. And I met some of them. I went traveling, and I found many of them, still carry their papers with them. Their land deeds or house titles, and they say, we didn't sell it. We own it outright. It's ours. It's 100 miles away, but we can't go to it because we're not Jewish. And some of them even have their keys still with them from their homes. This man told me his story, and it's like many other stories. He said there were bullets flying. They were fearing for their lives. They quickly locked their doors, shut it, maybe asked the neighbors to watch over their chickens, expecting they'll be back in 2 weeks, and fled for their lives, expecting, they'll be back. And now, more than 60 years later, this man and his family and the millions and millions and millions more like them have never been allowed to return to their homes and their lands. And the striking part about it is that I can go to his land. I'm Jewish. Israel is the self-proclaimed state of the Jewish people, open to all Jewish people. I can go to his land. If you're Jewish in this room, you can go to his land. We can go. We can buy his land or lease his land. We can farm his land. We can build a house on his land. And if his house is still there, we can live in his house on his land. He can't even visit because he's not Jewish. And there's so much discussion about the obviousness of a Jewish state. What does it mean if having a Jewish state requires the perpetual oppression and discrimination against another people? Does that change anything? When you ask a Palestinian if they recognize the right of Israel to exist, asking this man, do you recognize the right for there to be a state on your historic homeland that explicitly excludes you and your children and all of your people forever? They say, no, I don't think there's a right for that to happen. Is that anti-Semitism? Or is that a pretty predictable and understandable response that probably anyone would give in that situation? We never get any of this perspective, but it's very necessary, especially when we talk about this issue, that it's really not just about the occupation. The majority of Palestinians don't even have the luxury, if you can call it that, of living under occupation in their homeland. They're in exile, and they are as Palestinian as anybody living in Palestine. In 1948, I talked about 750,000 Palestinians fleeing, but there were Palestinians who remained in what became Israel. 1948 Palestinians, as they're often referred to, these are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So that means they're citizens, right? That means they have equal rights, right? Well, no, not at all, because they're not living in the state of the Israeli people. Israel's not the state of its citizens. Israel's not the state of any person who has its citizenship. Israel's the state, very, very clearly, of the Jewish people. So that's, the U.S. is supposedly the state of the American people. France is state, supposedly at least, of the French people. Germany, Israel's not the state of the Israeli people. It's the state of the Jewish people. It's the state of a whole bunch of people who aren't its citizens, like myself. And it's not the state of a whole bunch of people who are its citizens, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, who are living as a non-Jew in a Jewish state, a state that is created and maintained for the security and betterment and self-fulfillment of a population that they're not a part of. So what does this mean in practice? It means a whole slew of discriminatory apartheid laws that discriminate against non-Jews in Israel. For example, 93% of the land in Israel is either owned or managed indirectly through the Jewish National Fund, which means it's either extremely difficult for or outright impossible for a non-Jew to move onto it. 93% of the land. Voting. People might, I'm sure you've heard some of this. Well, Palestinians in Israel, they get to vote. It's not apartheid, it's democracy, etc. You can vote. You can even run for office if you're Palestinian. But if you run on a platform that says, I want Israel to be the state of all of its citizens. I want, as a citizen, for the state to be my state too, to support me too, you can be disqualified. Because the minute you say Israel should be the state of its citizens is the minute you have challenged and are rejecting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. So is that democracy when you're in a framework that actually precludes you from advocating for your equal rights? Does that count anymore in terms of voting? These are Bedouins, Palestinians in the Negev, the Nakab, who have, this is in the village of Al-Araqib, that has been destroyed more than 30 times. It might be up to 40, I haven't checked in a while. When time and time again the people in this village build their homes, they insist on staying on their land in the Negev, where their families have been as Bedouins for many times centuries. But Israel considers them unrecognized villages. They know there's a village there, but they don't recognize it. It's not on any map. It's not recognized as acceptable, and they want to condense the Bedouin population in cities. This is actually very similar to what happens to the indigenous people in the United States, is trying to condense them into areas to free up larger, natural spaces. And so they have, the army has actually come more than 30 times and destroyed, flattened their village, and each time they are rebuilding it. This is incredible, what's called in Arabic sumud, steadfastness, resilience, to do that over and over and over again. If you can imagine what it means to have your house demolished, to have your safe space, to look out your window every morning, to see if there's a bulldozer there. The psychological terror of that state, and the incredible resilience and steadfastness to decide we will not be chased off of our land like so many before us have been. We will stay here no matter how long it takes, is quite extraordinary. And if you ever have a chance to talk with 48 Palestinians, oftentimes people don't know that much about Palestinians in 48 Israel, but their story is as poignant as any other. Just showing you the Israeli flag as sort of a reminder of what the state is there in support of, and who's left out of this flag. There are many Israelis who are opposed to what Israel is doing, who are demonstrating, taking part in solidarity actions. Many people are very surprised when they hear Israelis and Palestinians are working together in solidarity to oppose Israeli policies, because they think somehow Jews and Palestinians, like, they don't mix, they can't work together, they never have gotten along. And that's nonsense, actually. In fact, relatively recently, less than 100 years ago, the people living in the area that became Israel, in historic Palestine, were the Palestinian people, and they were all different religions. There were Jews, there were Muslims, there were Christians, there were others as well, and they were living together in relative harmony. There were incidents from time to time, as there are still today everywhere, in different ways. But by and large, Jews were actually better treated within the Muslim and Arab world than almost anywhere in the Christian West. So oftentimes we really have a distorted view of history, and where traditional European anti-Semitism was precisely in Europe, and there wasn't sort of an inherent incompatibility of people. However, with the imposition of a political ideology in a state that was created not for all people in the area, but for one particular demographic and a whole bunch of new ones, the majority of of those populating the state of Israel were people who come recently or came thereafter, at the expense of and at the exclusion of another segment of the population. You saw violence arising, and I believe that we will continue to see violence. If really what we're after is an end to violence, we have to end the systems that discriminate against people and cause that violence. This is a demonstration by an Israeli activist against the wall, and we see on the ground today many Israelis. They're in solidarity with Palestinians, who are, of course, at the center of their freedom struggle. The Palestinian struggle for freedom is alive. It's been alive for much, much longer than many people think. People say nonviolent resistance began in 2000. It's been going on. You should read the great book, Mazen Kumsia's Popular Resistance in Palestine, talking about in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, First Intifada, the use of creative nonviolent tactics to resist Zionist oppression, and many times we see on the ground incredible actions where Palestinians march down to the land being taken to protest, to bear witness, to struggle for their freedom. Here's a group of Palestinians marching in Bethlehem, marching to the checkpoint to ask, why can't we go to Jerusalem too? The resistance itself is harshly retaliated against. Here you have tear gas being used, sound bombs. I've seen live ammunition, rubber bullets, etc., used against unarmed protesters. Here's hosing. They're using hosing like in the civil rights movement here in the United States, hosing protesters for resisting. And we recall that third pillar of apartheid, that there are laws and policies designed to suppress resistance to the regime. Maybe that's instructive to recall here. Mazen Kumsia, the one I just referred to with his book. These are the Palestinian freedom riders. So Palestinian resistance takes all different kinds of forms, and I think you guys had an action actually this morning at a bus stop talking about the injustice of segregation and segregated bus lines and buses on segregated roads. Maybe you can talk about it more in the Q&A. But as a form of resistance, maybe you talked about the freedom riders. The Palestinian freedom riders, taking inspiration from the civil rights freedom riders, decided to, in an act of civil disobedience, to board buses going to Jerusalem, even though they are not allowed to go to Jerusalem, saying, we want to go to Jerusalem as well. We are human beings. We should be able to take these buses too. And predictably, they were violently arrested and assaulted. This is Huwaida Arab, an amazing Palestinian American activist. And prisoners, Palestinian political prisoners, are number in the thousands. And I know that you guys have done some great stuff on that. I know yesterday there was a hunger strike in solidarity with the Palestinian political prisoner. I know that you guys are working on something in September that's going to be a benefit for Adamir, a Palestinian Prisoner Rights Association. It's really awesome that you guys are making those connections and talking about prisoners who are, of course, many in Palestine. In fact, 40% of Palestinian men in the West Bank and Gaza have spent some time in Israeli detention or prison at some point. And that's, by the way, very, very similar. I think it may be the same statistic for African American men in this country, in U.S. prisons. And the torture of Palestinian prisoners is, according to Amnesty International, systemic and widespread. So we recall 3 pillars of apartheid: codifying into law preferred identity, segregation, confining people to confining one population to small space, so-called security laws to suppress any opposition to the system. And we see why the South African government study actually did determine that Israel is indeed an apartheid state. We understand why we use this word in a week called Israeli Apartheid Week, which is all about bringing light to Israel's apartheid policies. And we actually can look very closely at a former apartheid regime. Not all apartheid regimes are the same, by the way. The apartheid definition is what should be used, not it being exactly the same as the South African apartheid. But we see here a comparison, actually, between the Bantustan system in South Africa and the Bantustanization of Palestine. We also can make those comparisons with what's happened in this country, as many people referred to earlier, of the indigenous people of this land being confined to smaller and smaller spaces, driven off of their land, in another kind of colonial model. And I find, I like these maps because they show the way in which the occupation is not sort of by itself, and if we could just end the occupation, everything would be fine, but actually that fits into this much longer and larger process of colonization over many years. But some Palestinians that I know really prefer these maps because it's not something in history. It's something that's going on over and over and over again with every passing minute and hour. And it will continue, and it does continue until it's stopped. And Palestinians are struggling on the ground to stop it. But like any civil rights movement, they need support and are asking for support from the outside world. And that then comes to us about what can we do. And like I said, a lot of great stuff is happening already on campus, and I'd love to maybe even ask representatives of different organizations here to say maybe like a minute or two. So if you're from one of those, maybe prepare in your head, just maybe not even a minute, like literally like 45 seconds about what you're doing to hear more about what's already happening. But there are great organizations here locally. You don't have to do it alone. Just join on to what others are doing. In fact, now might be, well, maybe after, we can pass around a sign-up sheet if you want to get more involved. The University of Texas Palestine Solidarity Committee focuses solely on this issue, as far as I know, and has been doing great work for a long time. The Society for Islamic Awareness, who put on this event, thank you so much, and also very active in supporting Palestinian rights on campus. The Interfaith Coalition for Palestinian Rights. Is there anyone from ICPR here tonight? So they're a community group. They're not on campus, but they do good work. And if you are interested, if you're not here on campus, but you do want to get involved in the broader Austin community on this issue, let me know. I can put you in touch with them. There's a whole bunch of other groups here: ISO, MSA that I mentioned, Third Coast, Iraq Vets Against the War, Code Pink, etc. There is so much happening here already. Don't be intimidated. Get involved. It's extremely rewarding to be involved in activism on this issue. And yes, it's already happening. Here's the wall that I have yet to see, but this is my interest. I'll look at it afterwards. But if you haven't seen it yet, please stop by. It's really, really cool that that's being done. They already talked about them, but these are some of the remaining events happening. The screening of 5 broken cameras, so that there you can actually see a bit more of the kinds of resistance happening in a village, Belaine, in protest of the wall, and the kind of retaliation from the Israeli army. All of these are really really important cultural resistance. I'll talk about. Yes, all of this is very important. So I hope you guys will take advantage of everything that's happening. And the main thing that I want to talk about as a VDS organizer is the VDS movement: boycott, divestment, sanctions. In 2005, Palestinian civil society, more than 170 Palestinian civil society organizations from all parts of the Palestinian community, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in 48 Israel, in the diaspora, came together to say, international community, if you want to support us, this is what we want from you. We want you to end your complicity. We want you to boycott, divest, and impose sanctions on Israel. We want you to stop investing in our misery, stop profiting